guys, Sherson here from the Generation Hustle podcast, and this week we're going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be taking over this episode because I wanted to take the time to explore a topic that was very near and dear to my heart: drugs. Just kidding. So in light of New York becoming the 15th state to decriminalize recreational marijuana, which happened on March 31st, we wanted to explore the real reason marijuana was illegal to begin with. Matter of fact, it's not even called marijuana. That was just a word that they made up. So let's get right into it. So this story is going to include a lot of figures and events throughout history, but I'll focus on the key points and the key characters, which will be Richard Nixon, who was the 37th president of the United States, Harry Anslinger, head of the Treasury Department's Bureau of Narcotics, and William Randolph Hearst, who was an American businessman who I guarantee you're going to grow to hate after this story. So throughout the 19th century, cannabis hemp was one of the most widely used plants. Hemp was used for a wide range of things like rope, twine, cloth, sails, even canvas. The word canvas is derived from cannabis. Sailing ships used hemp sails instead of cotton sails because cotton sails deteriorated in the salt water. And the old hemp sails, once they weren't used on the sails anymore or on the ships anymore, they were actually made into wagon covers. And that same material was ultimately responsible for creating the first original Levi's jeans. So essentially, we should have called it Mary Jean, not Mary Jane, but I digress. Also from that, hemp seeds were used for oils, so they pressed them to create oils that were used for paints and varnishes, which is also another important topic for later on in the story. But essentially, everyone knew what hemp was, but nobody knew what marijuana was. So this is where William Randolph Hearst enters the story, the American businessman. Hearst had a myriad of companies under his name, but Hearst companies were a major consumer of the cheap tree pulp paper that had replaced hemp paper in the late 19th century. There's a reason how and why this happened, which we'll get to. The Hearst Corporation was a major logging company and produced this chemical-drenched tree pulp paper, which yellowed really fast and fell apart after a short amount of time. Essentially, it was very low-quality paper in comparison to hemp paper. Hearst also owned Hearst Newspapers, which was essentially his media empire. So to break down the vertical of businesses here, he has a logging company, which is deforesting and using the trees to create pulp. He has a paper company, which is using this pulp to create this cheap, low-quality paper. And he also had a newspaper company, which is his media empire, and he's using that for stories and essentially for propaganda. One thing to note here is that Hearst was an incredibly racist person. He hated all minorities: poor people, black people, Asian people, Hindus, Mexican, whatever. You name it, he hated them. He was mostly afraid of Mexican companies that were running with hemp paper, which would put his company in danger since the low-cost, high-quality paper made from hemp could easily replace the low-cost, low-quality paper that he was producing. So he needed to figure out a way to keep his companies afloat. Around this time as well, after the Depression, the government was reviewing the need for a lot of its agencies, and on its list was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They were trying to understand, do we need all these agencies? Can we save money in some of these places? And can we reduce some red tape? Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was very worried about this. He was worried that they may come down in his department, and he needed to figure out a way to keep his position alive and his department running. Because, you know, people in power love holding power. So he decided to work on the Marijuana Tax Act. And how this comes into play is he needed a war on drugs so that he can keep his bureau intact and have a purpose for it, which coincided with Hearst's need for cannabis to be eradicated so that his paper companies can thrive. Hearst newspapers started running incredulous stories of the dangers of marijuana. The word itself, spelled with an H, is the actual word from Mexican culture, but they just switched the H to J in his articles because it made it a bit more foreign, and, you know, foreign is synonymous with fear. During this time as well, Anslinger was claiming that the majority of pot smokers were minorities, including African Americans, and that marijuana had a negative effect on these degenerate races, such as inducing violence or causing insanity. He even went as far as noting that reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. One of his biggest fears was that he believed smoking pot would result in white women having sex with minorities, which, you know, sure. Around this time was also when Reefer Madness came out. And if you don't know what that was, this was probably the propaganda move that pushed all this over the edge.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
I'm going to let you digest that and make of that what you will. But I do want to point out that it's hilarious that they've made a point to say the marijuana was being rolled into harmless cigarettes because cigarettes are harmless. At the time, the federal government did not have the power to prohibit cannabis. So Anslinger went a roundabout way. He testified under oath to a limited committee meeting about the horrors of cannabis, even leveraging the stories from Hearst newspapers as examples. So this was a clear ploy by bad actors, prohibition police and bureaucrats working in collusion with chemical companies and fossil fuel companies to kind of push an agenda. So once the act passed, the Marijuana Tax Act, the tax levied a fine so high that cannabis was essentially illegal since no one could afford to pay the fines. The same year that the act passed, so many businesses started falling into place. Oil companies patented nylon, which was a synthetic fiber that would take over the textile and cordage market that would have been dominated by hemp had none of this happened. More than half the American cars on the road were built by General Motors, which guaranteed that chemical and oil companies had a captive market for paints, varnishes, plastics, and rubber, all of which actually could have been made cheaper and better using hemp. Essentially, all competition from hemp had been outlawed. Now you might be thinking, all this information was out there, so how did this happen? It's important to note that all this happened during an era where we didn't have Google at our fingertips to look up the scientific papers around cannabis. We also couldn't look up the Hearst newspaper articles and stories to verify that they were true, because if we could, we would see that a lot of this information was falsified or just outright lies. Another thing to consider, though, is the power of compounding as it pertains to propaganda. The propaganda was so strong to start that the masses already believed the lie, and it was too late to kind of reverse that. And it was only compounded more by Richard Nixon. In 1968, Richard Nixon had a reputation problem as he was running for election, and he needed to figure out a way to win back support. Nixon, who was a Republican, figured that he can get political support from white voters in the South, who were traditionally Democrats, if he appealed to their racism against African Americans. He essentially doubled down on Harry Anslinger's efforts to have marijuana associated with racial minorities and the counterculture, and spent much of his campaign asserting that their use of drugs like marijuana was threatening America's social climate of order and justice.
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had.
To prove this point, here's a quote from John Ehrlichman, who was the assistant to the president for domestic affairs under Richard Nixon. You know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and the black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we can disrupt those communities. We can arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Today, cannabis is still legal at the federal level, although majority of the states have decriminalized it or allow its use under certain guidelines. This may change under Joe Biden. We're still not sure yet. We're waiting on that answer as well. Cannabis markets are waiting on that answer because this is another billion-dollar industry that's waiting to explode. Now, this was a pretty condensed explanation of events, but you can see clearly how government entities, people in power, and elite businesses rich with cash can literally change public sentiment through lies, while also profiteering off those consequences. Good thing that doesn't happen anymore, right?